She was standing at the edge of Coroa Vermelha Beach when I first saw her, watching the sunset, with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing it, as if she knew she wouldn't see many more. Her white dress moved in the ocean breeze, and even from 50 meters away, I could see she was crying. I'm not usually the kind of man who approaches strangers, especially not beautiful women crying on beaches, but something about her posture, the way she held herself against the wind, made me walk toward her without thinking. I am Miguel Santos, 55 years old, a history professor from São Paulo who came to Porto Seguro to escape a life that had become unbearably predictable. My wife of 28 years had left me for a younger colleague. My children were grown and distant. My research on Brazilian colonial history felt increasingly irrelevant, so I'd taken a sabbatical, rented a small house near the beach, and planned to spend 6 months writing the book I'd been postponing for a decade. That was 3 weeks ago. The book remained unwritten, but my life was about to become anything but predictable. "Desculpe," I said when I reached her, using the formal Portuguese that marked me as someone from outside Bahia. "Are you all right?" She turned to look at me, and I saw that she was probably in her early 40s, strikingly beautiful in the way that suggested both Brazilian and European ancestry, with eyes that were green but held flecks of gold that caught the sunset light. Her face was wet with tears, but she smiled slightly as if amused by my concern. "I'm fine," she said in Portuguese that carried a faint accent I couldn't place. "Just saying goodbye to someone." I looked around, seeing no one else on this stretch of beach. "Where did they go?" Her smile deepened, becoming sad. "He's been gone for a long time. I'm just finally accepting it." There was something about the way she said it, the weight of those words, that suggested a story far more complicated than a simple breakup or divorce. I should have walked away then, should have respected her privacy and returned to my rented house and my unwritten book. But I didn't. "I'm Miguel," I said instead. "I'm staying nearby. Can I walk with you back toward town?" She studied me for a long moment, her green-gold eyes assessing something I couldn't identify. Then she nodded. "I'm Elena, and yes, I'd like the company. I've been alone for too long." We walked along the beach as the sun disappeared into the Atlantic, and Elena told me about Porto Seguro, about the history I already knew from my academic work but had never experienced through the eyes of someone who lived it. She spoke about the arrival of Pedro Álvares Cabral in 1500, about the first contact between Portuguese explorers and Tupiniquim indigenous people, about how this beach, this exact stretch of sand we were walking on, had witnessed the beginning of Brazil as a colonial entity. "Everything started here," she said, gesturing at the coastline that had changed dramatically in 500 years, but remained fundamentally the same. All of Brazilian history, all the complexity and tragedy and beauty, it all began in Porto Seguro. Sometimes I think the past never really leaves this place. It just accumulates, layer upon layer, until you can feel the weight of 5 centuries pressing down on the sand. It was a poetic way to describe history, more emotional than academic, but it resonated with something I'd been feeling since arriving in Porto Seguro. The sense that time moved differently here, that the past was closer to the surface than in other places. We reached the path that led from the beach to the main road, and Elena paused. "Would you like to have dinner?" she asked. "There's a restaurant in the old town that serves the best moqueca in Bahia, my treat, to thank you for the company." I should have said no. Should have recognized that there was something unusual about this encounter, something that didn't quite fit the normal pattern of meeting strangers. But Elena's smile was warm and her eyes were sad, and I'd spent 3 weeks eating alone in my rented house. "I'd love to," I said. The restaurant was in Porto Seguro's historic center, in a colonial building that dated to the 17th century, with thick walls and narrow windows, and a view of the Burenhem River. Elena ordered for both of us in rapid Bahian Portuguese, and the owner greeted her warmly, as if she were a regular customer despite her claim of having been alone for too long. Over moqueca and farofa and cold beer, Elena told me about her life, or at least fragments of it. She'd grown up in Porto Seguro, left for university in Salvador, travelled extensively through Europe and North America, and returned home 5 years ago after a relationship ended badly. She worked as a cultural consultant for tourism companies, helping them understand and respect the indigenous and Afro-Brazilian history of the region. She lived alone in a house near Trancoso, preferred solitude to the crowded beaches, and came to Coroa Vermelha whenever she needed to think. "What brings you to Porto Seguro?" she asked as we finished the meal. "Research? Tourism? Running from something?" The perceptiveness of the question caught me off guard. "How did you know I was running?" She laughed, a sound that was both genuine and melancholic. "Because you have the look of a man who left his life behind, but hasn't decided what comes next. I recognize it because I had the same look 5 years ago." I told her about my sabbatical, about the failing marriage and the book I couldn't write, and the general sense that my life in Sao Paulo had become a performance I no longer wanted to maintain. She listened carefully, asking occasional questions, never offering platitudes or easy solutions. And when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture that was both intimate and comforting. "Miguel, can I tell you something that might sound strange?" I nodded, feeling the warmth of her hand, the slight calluses that suggested she worked with her hands as well as her mind. "Meeting you tonight wasn't an accident. I've been coming to that beach at sunset for 2 months, waiting for someone. I didn't know who, didn't know what they'd look like or when they'd appear, but I knew I'd recognize them when they came. And when I saw you walking toward me, I knew you were the one I'd been waiting for." The rational part of my mind, the history professor who'd spent 30 years evaluating evidence and questioning romantic narratives, told me this was absurd. People didn't wait for strangers on beaches. Meaningful encounters didn't happen because of cosmic timing. Elena was likely lonely, possibly unstable, certainly dramatic in the way that beautiful women sometimes are when they want to create mystique. But the part of me that had walked away from my predictable life, that had come to Porto Seguro seeking something undefined, wanted to believe her. "Why were you waiting for someone?" I asked. Elena's expression became serious, the playfulness disappearing from her green-gold eyes. "Because I need help with something I can't do alone. Something dangerous and possibly illegal and definitely crazy. And I needed someone who was smart enough to understand it, brave enough to attempt it, and disconnected enough from their old life that they'd be willing to risk everything for a stranger." She paused, studying my face. "You're that person, Miguel. I can feel it. The question is whether you're ready to be." I should have stood up, thanked her for dinner, and walked away from whatever this was becoming. But I'd spent 3 weeks in Porto Seguro being careful and safe and accomplishing nothing. And Elena's hand was still holding mine, and her eyes were challenging me to be someone different than the man I'd been. "Tell me what you need help with," I said, "and I'll decide if I'm brave enough or crazy enough to do it." Elena smiled then, a smile that held relief and anticipation and something darker that I couldn't identify. "Not here," she said. "Come to my house tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. I'll show you everything." She wrote her address on a napkin, paid the bill despite my protests, and walked me to where I'd left my rental car. At the car, she kissed me on the cheek, a gesture that felt both like a promise and a farewell. "Thank you for talking to me tonight," she said. "And Miguel, don't research me, don't look me up online or ask locals about me. I know you'll be tempted, but trust me when I say that what you learn secondhand will make you not come tomorrow, and I need you to come. So just trust me for one more night, and tomorrow I'll tell you everything." Then she disappeared into the narrow streets of the historic center, leaving me standing beside my car with her address in my hand and 100 questions in my mind. I drove back to my rented house and tried to sleep, but Elena's words kept replaying. Something dangerous and possibly illegal and definitely crazy. Don't research me. I need you to come. Every instinct told me this was a situation I should avoid. A beautiful stranger with mysterious problems that would inevitably become my problems if I involved myself further. But I also couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd looked at sunset, the sadness in her eyes, the sense that she was carrying a burden she'd carried alone for too long. At 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and did exactly what Elena had asked me not to do. I opened my laptop and searched for her name, Elena, cultural consultant, Porto Seguro. What I found was a single news article from 5 years ago, published in the Bahia state newspaper. The headline read, "Tourist dies in diving accident off Recife de Fora. Wife survives, questions remain." The article described how Tiago Mendes, a marine biologist from São Paulo, had died while diving near Porto Seguro's famous coral reefs. He'd been with his wife, Elena Mendes, who'd survived despite being underwater when her husband suffered what was described as sudden equipment failure, leading to rapid ascent and fatal pulmonary barotrauma. The investigation had concluded it was a tragic accident, equipment failure that couldn't have been prevented. But the article noted that some of Tiago's colleagues had questioned the findings, suggesting that the equipment had been tampered with, that Elena had motives for wanting her husband dead, that the investigation had been cursory and possibly influenced by Elena's family connections. No charges were ever filed. The case was closed, and Elena had apparently spent the last 5 years living alone near Trancoso, working as a cultural consultant, waiting on beaches at sunset for strangers who might help her with something dangerous and possibly illegal. I sat in the darkness of my rented house, staring at the article, trying to decide what to do. The rational choice was obvious. Don't go to Elena's house, don't involve yourself in whatever this was. Return to São Paulo and your safe, predictable life, or stay in Porto Seguro and write your book without the complications of a beautiful widow with a possibly suspicious past. But I kept thinking about her eyes at sunset, about the way she'd said, "I've been alone for too long," about the sense that we'd met not by accident, but by some design I didn't yet understand. And I realized that I'd come to Porto Seguro precisely because I wanted my life to be less predictable, wanted to feel something other than the comfortable numbness of routine. Elena was offering that, even if it came with risks I couldn't yet evaluate. At dawn, I made my decision. I would go to her house. I would listen to what she wanted to tell me, and then I would decide whether to help her or walk away. But I wouldn't make that decision based on fear or caution, or the comfortable safety of the life I'd left behind. I'd make it based on what I learned, what I felt, what seemed right in the moment rather than what seemed safe from a distance. At 9:30, I drove north from Porto Seguro toward Trancoso, following the coastal road that wound through remnants of Atlantic rainforest and past beaches that ranged from crowded tourist destinations to isolated stretches of sand where the only sounds were waves and wind. Elena's address led me to a house set back from the road, hidden behind tropical vegetation, with a view of the ocean through gaps in the trees. It was a beautiful property, designed in the traditional Bahian style, with a thatched roof and wide verandas. But there was something melancholic about it, as if it had been built for joy, but had known only solitude. Elena was waiting on the veranda when I arrived, wearing simple clothes, her hair pulled back, looking both younger and more tired than she had the night before. "You came," she said, and I heard relief in her voice. "I was afraid you'd research me and decide I was too complicated." I decided to be honest. "I did research you. I found the article about your husband's death, and I'm here anyway." Her expression changed, becoming guarded. "Then you think I killed him?" "That's what everyone thinks, even though they never say it directly. Beautiful wife, wealthy husband, convenient accident." I sat down in the chair across from her, studying her face. "I don't know what I think. That's why I'm here. To find out the truth." Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the ocean. Then she began to speak, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of 5 years of silence. "Tiago didn't die in an equipment failure. He was murdered. And I know who killed him and why, but I can't prove it. And even if I could, the killer is too powerful to face through normal channels. That's why I need help. That's why I've been waiting for someone like you, someone smart enough to understand what I'm dealing with and disconnected enough to take risks that others wouldn't." She turned to face me. "I'm not asking you to help me get revenge. I'm asking you to help me find evidence that will force the authorities to reopen the case, to investigate properly this time, to bring Tiago's killer to justice through the legal system. It's dangerous, because the person who killed him has already demonstrated they're willing to kill to protect their secrets. It's possibly illegal because we'll need to access places and information we're not supposed to access. And it's crazy because we'll be going up against someone with resources and connections and absolutely no conscience." She paused. "But it's also right. Tiago deserves justice. And I deserve to stop being the woman everyone suspects killed her husband. So I'm asking you, Miguel Santos, history professor from São Paulo, man who came to Porto Seguro to escape his old life, will you help me? I should have asked more questions before answering. Should have demanded details about who killed Tiago and why, what evidence Elena thought existed, what specifically she needed me to do. But looking at her face, seeing the desperation mixed with determination, feeling the weight of 5 years she'd spent living under suspicion and grief, I found myself nodding. "I'll help you," I said. "But I need to know everything, all of it. No more mystery, no more carefully measured information. If we're doing this, I need the complete truth." Elena's smile was brilliant and heartbreaking. "Thank you. Thank you for trusting me enough to help. And you're right, you deserve the complete truth." She went inside and returned with a folder thick with documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. For the next 3 hours, she told me everything. Tiago had been a marine biologist, studying the coral reefs around Porto Seguro, documenting their health and advocating for stronger environmental protections. His research had documented that certain tourism companies were causing significant damage through irresponsible diving practices, anchor damage, and pollution from boat traffic. He'd compiled evidence that would have justified restricting or banning several major tour operators from the reef areas, which would have cost them millions in lost revenue. One company in particular, Porto Seguro Marine Adventures, owned by a man named Gustavo Rocha, had the most to lose from Tiago's research. Gustavo was well-connected politically, wealthy, and according to Elena, absolutely ruthless in protecting his business interests. Tiago presented his preliminary findings to the Environmental Council 3 weeks before he died, Elena explained. Gustavo was there and he was furious. He threatened Tiago publicly, said that he'd regret trying to destroy honest businesses with his environmental extremism. 2 weeks later, Tiago and I went diving at Recife de Fora, the same dive we'd done dozens of times. We were 50 feet down when his regulator failed. Not gradually, not in a way that gave warning. It just stopped delivering air completely. She showed me photographs of the regulator taken during the investigation. I'm not a technical expert, but even I could see this wasn't normal wear and tear. The valve had been deliberately damaged, tampered with in a way that would cause catastrophic failure underwater. But the investigation concluded it was an accident, that saltwater corrosion had weakened the component, that it was tragic but unavoidable. They never seriously considered that it might have been sabotage. Elena pulled out more documents, showing connections between Gustavo Rocha and the investigator who'd handled the case, between Rocha and the local police chief, between Rocha and officials who should have been overseeing the investigation impartially. I tried to get the case reopened. I hired lawyers, presented evidence of Gustavo's threats, pointed out the obvious problems with the investigation, but no one would listen. Gustavo has too much power, too many connections. And I became the convenient villain, the wife who maybe wanted her husband dead for his insurance money or his research or whatever motive people invented. She looked at me with those green gold eyes. That's why I need someone from outside. Someone with no connections to Porto Seguro's power structure. We need to find evidence so compelling that it can't be ignored, that forces a proper investigation regardless of Gustavo's influence. And I think I know where that evidence is. But I need help getting it. I studied the documents she'd shown me, the photographs, the connections she'd mapped out. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it was enough to suggest that she was right, that Tiago's death hadn't been an accident, and that the investigation had been compromised. What kind of evidence are we looking for? I asked. Elena leaned forward. Gustavo keeps everything. He's paranoid and controlling. And according to someone who used to work for him, he documented all his business dealings, including the illegal ones. There's a safe in his office at the Porto Seguro Marine Adventures headquarters. In that safe are financial records, communications, possibly even direct evidence of his involvement in Tiago's death. If we can get access to those documents, photograph them, get them to the right authorities, we can force a real investigation. I understood immediately what she was asking. You want us to break into his office and crack his safe. That's the dangerous and possibly illegal part. Elena nodded. Yes. And I know how insane that sounds. But Miguel, I've spent 5 years trying every legal avenue. No one will listen. No one will investigate properly. This is my last option. Either we get the evidence that proves what Gustavo did, or I spend the rest of my life as the woman who probably killed her husband and got away with it. I can't live like that anymore. I stood up and walked to the edge of the veranda, looking out at the ocean that had killed Elena's husband, whether by accident or murder. Everything about this situation screamed that I should refuse, should wish Elena luck and return to my safe sabbatical and my unwritten book. But I thought about Tiago, a marine biologist trying to protect the reefs he loved, threatened by a powerful businessman, and then conveniently dead before he could cause problems. I thought about Elena, spending 5 years under suspicion, unable to mourn properly because everyone thought she was a murderer. And I thought about myself, 55 years old, recently divorced, supposedly in Porto Seguro, to find meaning or purpose, or something that felt more real than the life I'd left behind. This was insane and dangerous and possibly criminal. It was also exactly the kind of meaning I'd been looking for. All right, I said, turning back to face Elena. I'll help you, but we need to plan this carefully. When does Gustavo's office have the least security? How do we get in? How do we open the safe? What's our exit strategy if something goes wrong? Elena's smile was radiant. I've been planning this for 2 months. I have everything worked out. I just needed someone to help me execute it, someone I could trust. She pulled out more documents, blueprints of the Porto Seguro Marine Adventures building, security schedules, photographs of the safe. Gustavo goes to São Paulo every month for business meetings. He'll be gone this weekend, Friday through Monday. His office building has security, but it's minimal at night. 1 guard who makes rounds every 2 hours. The safe is a Tramontina model that uses a 4-digit code. I know someone who used to work there, who saw Gustavo enter the code multiple times. It's his daughter's birthday, 1507. She showed me the entry plan, the timing, the tools we'd need, the documentation we'd photograph once we accessed the safe. It was detailed and careful and completely insane. When do we do this? I asked, already knowing the answer. Saturday night, 2 days from now. Can you be ready? We spent the next 2 days preparing, and during that time, I got to know Elena in ways that went far beyond the immediate crisis we were planning. She showed me Porto Seguro through her eyes, taking me to places tourists never saw. Indigenous villages where Pataxo people maintained traditions despite 5 centuries of colonization. Afro-Brazilian communities where capoeira and candomblé remained vital cultural practices, quiet beaches where you could still imagine what the coastline looked like when Cabral's ships arrived in 1500. She told me about her marriage to Tiago, about how they'd met in Salvador while she was studying anthropology, and he was researching marine ecosystems, about how they dreamed of making Porto Seguro a model for sustainable tourism that respected both the environment and the local cultures. "He wasn't perfect," she said, as we walked along a deserted beach north of Trancoso. "He could be obsessive about his work, neglectful of our relationship, so focused on the reefs that he sometimes forgot about the human being sleeping next to him. But he was good. He was trying to do something meaningful with his life. And Gustavo killed him for it, for caring more about coral than about profit." I asked her why she hadn't left Porto Seguro, why she'd stayed in a place where everyone suspected her of murder. Because leaving would have felt like admitting guilt. And because this is my home. My family has been in Bahia for 400 years, mixing Portuguese and indigenous and African blood until we're something uniquely Brazilian. I'm not letting Gustavo Rocha drive me away from my own home. We kissed for the first time on that beach, with the sunset turning the ocean gold and the wind carrying the scent of salt and tropical flowers. It felt both inevitable and dangerous, a complication neither of us needed, but both of us wanted. "This is probably a terrible idea," I said when we finally pulled apart. Elena laughed. "Breaking into a powerful businessman's office to steal evidence that he murdered my husband? Or kissing you?" I smiled. "Both, but I was specifically referring to the kissing." She touched my face gently. "Miguel, I'm not looking for a new husband or even a long-term relationship. I'm looking for someone who can help me get justice for the last husband. What happens between us after that, if anything, we can figure out later. For now, let's just be two people who are less alone than we were." It should have bothered me, the transactional nature of our connection, the acknowledgement that I was fundamentally a tool for achieving her goal. But it didn't, because I was using her too, using this adventure to feel alive again, to be someone other than the predictable professor going through a predictable midlife crisis. We were using each other, and we were both honest about it. That felt more real than most relationships I'd had. Saturday night arrived with the kind of darkness that only happens in coastal areas far from major cities. We drove to Porto Seguro in Elena's car, dressed in dark clothes, carrying a backpack with tools we'd acquired over the previous 2 days, a portable angle grinder in case the safe proved harder to open than expected, a high-resolution camera for photographing documents, flashlights with red filters that wouldn't alert security. The Porto Seguro Marine Adventures headquarters was in a commercial area near the port, a modern 2-story building that looked prosperous and legitimate. We parked 2 blocks away and watched the building for an hour, timing the security guards' rounds, confirming Elena's information about the minimal overnight security. At 1:15 in the morning, with the guard having just completed his hourly round, we approached the building. Elena had a key that she'd obtained from her contact, a former employee who'd kept it when he was fired. The key opened a side door that led to a storage area, and from there we made our way to the 2nd floor where Gustavo's office was located. The office was exactly as Elena had described, large, expensive, with windows overlooking the port and walls decorated with photographs of happy tourists enjoying marine adventures. The safe was behind a painting, obvious and cliched, exactly where Elena had said it would be. I punched in the code 1507, Gustavo's daughter's birthday, and the safe opened with a quiet click. Inside was everything Elena had promised and more. Financial records showing payments to the investigator who'd handled Tiago's death, communications with local officials that documented bribes and influence peddling, environmental impact reports that Gustavo had commissioned privately and then hidden because they confirmed everything Tiago had been claiming about reef damage. And most damning, emails between Gustavo and someone identified only as M, discussing the biologist problem and arranging an accident that can't be traced back to us. I began photographing everything while Elena kept watch, her hands shaking despite her attempts to stay calm. We'd been in the office for 20 minutes when we heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The security guard making an unscheduled round. Elena and I looked at each other in panic. There was no time to close the safe and rehang the painting, no time to hide the evidence of what we'd been doing. The door handle began to turn. And in that moment, Elena did something I didn't expect. She kissed me, passionately, pulling me away from the safe and toward Gustavo's desk, knocking over a lamp and making enough noise to alert the guard to our presence. The door opened, and the guard stood there, flashlight raised, staring at us with surprise and confusion. "Desculpe," Elena said breathlessly, her Portuguese carrying the embarrassment of someone caught in an intimate moment. We wanted somewhere private and thought the building was empty." The guard, a young man who looked barely 20, didn't know how to respond. He glanced around the office, seeing the open safe but apparently not registering its significance in his confusion over finding a couple making out in his secured building. "You can't be here," he said finally. "This is private property. How did you get in?" Elena launched into a story about a friend who worked in the building, about borrowing a key, about too much drinking and poor judgment. She was brilliant, playing the embarrassed tourist who'd made a stupid mistake, apologizing profusely while gradually steering the guard away from examining the office too closely. Meanwhile, I casually moved to close the safe, trying to make it look like I was just straightening my clothes, but actually securing the evidence of our break-in. The guard eventually decided we were just drunk idiots rather than serious criminals. He escorted us out of the building, lectured us about trespassing, and watched us walk away into the night. We made it 2 blocks before Elena started laughing, the kind of slightly hysterical laughter that comes after extreme stress and relief. "Did you get everything?" she asked when she could finally speak. I patted the camera in my pocket. "Everything. 237 photographs, including emails that are going to send Gustavo to prison." We drove back to Elena's house and spent the rest of the night going through the photographs, organizing them, preparing documentation that would prove not just that Tiago's death was murder, but that the subsequent investigation had been compromised by bribery and corruption at multiple levels. It was more than enough to force a reopening of the case, more than enough to destroy Gustavo Rocha's business and reputation, more than enough to give Elena back her name and her life. But as dawn broke over the ocean, visible from Elena's veranda, a darker reality became clear. We'd stolen the evidence. We'd broken into a private office, opened a safe without permission, photographed documents that were legally Gustavo's property. A competent defense attorney would argue that the evidence was inadmissible, obtained through illegal means, that Gustavo's rights had been violated. And if we tried to use this evidence directly, we'd be confessing to crimes that could send us both to prison. "We can't go to the authorities with this," I said, understanding the trap we'd created. "Not directly. They'll ask how we obtained it, and we'll have no good answer." Elena nodded, her face showing she'd already reached the same conclusion. "Then we leak it, anonymously. Send it to journalists, to environmental organizations, to federal prosecutors who aren't connected to the local corruption. Create enough pressure that they have to investigate, have to find this evidence through their own legal means." It was a plan, but a risky one. We'd be hoping that federal authorities would investigate aggressively enough to find what we'd found, that journalists would publish stories that would force official action, that the web of corruption protecting Gustavo wasn't so extensive that it reached Brasilia. But it was the only plan we had. Over the next week, Elena and I carefully distributed the evidence. We sent encrypted files to investigative journalists at major Brazilian newspapers. We provided anonymous tips to federal environmental prosecutors. We contacted international marine conservation organizations that had the resources and credibility to pressure Brazilian authorities. And then we waited trying to act normal while knowing that we'd set in motion forces we couldn't control. The response was faster than expected. Within 10 days, the first news articles appeared, documenting Gustavo Rocha's environmental violations and suggesting possible connections to Tiago Mendes's death. Within 3 weeks, federal prosecutors announced they were reviewing the original investigation into Tiago's death. Within 6 weeks, Gustavo Rocha was arrested on charges of murder, corruption, and environmental crimes. The evidence we'd photographed had been discovered during a legal search of his office, with federal investigators claiming they'd received anonymous tips that led them to investigate Porto Seguro marine adventures. The safe had been opened legally this time, with warrants and witnesses, but the documents inside were the same ones Elena and I had photographed that Saturday night. Gustavo's trial took 8 months, and throughout it, Elena and I watched from a careful distance, never publicly acknowledging our role in the investigation, never confirming or denying when people whispered that Elena had finally gotten her revenge. The evidence was overwhelming. The emails discussing the biologist problem were particularly damning. Gustavo's conviction was inevitable, and he received a 25-year sentence for murder, corruption, and environmental destruction. Elena was officially cleared of any suspicion in Tiago's death. The stigma she'd carried for 5 years evaporated as the truth came out, as people realized she'd been right all along about her husband's murder. She was able to mourn properly, finally, to visit Tiago's grave without feeling like a fraud, to remember him without the weight of everyone's suspicion. But the victory felt hollow, in ways I hadn't anticipated. We'd achieved justice through illegal means, had broken laws to expose crimes, had become criminals ourselves to catch a murderer. The moral complexity of what we'd done haunted me in ways that my comfortable academic life never had. "Do you regret it?" Elena asked me one night as we sat on her veranda, 3 months after Gustavo's conviction. "Helping me? Breaking the law? Risking everything for someone you'd just met?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "No, I don't regret it. But I'm not proud of it either. We did the right thing in the wrong way, and I'm not sure those cancel each other out." Elena took my hand, the same gesture she'd made the first night we'd met. "Tiago used to say that moral purity is a luxury that people protecting the powerless can't always afford, that sometimes doing right means getting your hands dirty. I think he'd be proud of what we did, even if we had to break rules to do it." I wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that the ends had justified the means, that justice achieved through questionable methods was still justice. But my academic training, my belief in systems and processes, and the rule of law made it harder to accept such pragmatic morality. Our relationship evolved in the months after Gustavo's conviction, becoming something neither of us had quite expected. Elena and I became lovers in the full sense, sharing not just the intensity of our conspiracy, but genuine affection, companionship, and the slow building of trust that comes from choosing each other repeatedly rather than being thrown together by crisis. I extended my sabbatical indefinitely, eventually accepting that I wouldn't return to São Paulo, that my old life was over, and I was building a new one in Porto Seguro with a woman who'd asked me to help her commit crimes for justice. We never married, never made formal commitments, but we built a life together that felt more real than my 28-year marriage had ever felt. I helped Elena with her cultural consulting work, using my historical knowledge to add depth to her understanding of colonial impact on indigenous and Afro-Brazilian communities. She helped me finally write my book, which evolved from academic history into something more personal, a meditation on how the past shapes the present, on how 500 years of history accumulates in places like Porto Seguro, on how we're all haunted by crimes committed long before we were born. The book was published 2 years after I met Elena, and it was better than anything I'd written in my academic career. Not because the scholarship was superior, but because it was honest about complexity, about moral ambiguity, about the ways that seeking justice often requires compromising principles. Critics called it surprisingly personal for a work of history. They didn't know that it was really about a widow and a divorced professor who'd broken the law together and fallen in love in the process. 5 years after we met, Elena and I were having breakfast on her veranda when she said something that surprised me. "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone. About the day Tiago died." I set down my coffee, sensing this would be important. Elena took a deep breath. "I told you that Tiago's regulator failed and he died of pulmonary barotrauma from rapid ascent. That's true. But what I didn't tell you is that I could have saved him. When his regulator failed, we were 50 feet down. I had air. I could have buddy-breathed with him, shared my regulator, brought him up slowly. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what I was trained to do." She paused, her green-gold eyes filled with something between guilt and defiance. But in that moment underwater, watching him panic, watching him reach for me, I hesitated. For maybe 5 seconds, I hesitated. Because part of me remembered all the fights we'd had, all the times he'd prioritized his research over our marriage, all the ways he'd made me feel secondary to his coral reefs and his environmental crusade. And in those 5 seconds, I thought about how much easier my life would be if he was just gone. Her voice was barely a whisper now. Then I came to my senses, reached for him, tried to share air. But those 5 seconds of hesitation meant he'd already started his panicked descent. He shot toward the surface too fast, and by the time I caught up to him, it was too late. His lungs had already ruptured. There was nothing I could do except watch him die on the surface, blood coming from his mouth, knowing that if I'd reacted immediately instead of hesitating, he might have survived. I sat frozen, processing what she'd just told me. "Elena, you're saying—" She nodded. "I'm saying that Gustavo Rocha did sabotage Tiago's equipment. The murder charge was legitimate. But I'm also saying that my hesitation contributed to Tiago's death. If I'd been a better wife, a more selfless person, if I'd reacted instantly instead of letting dark thoughts delay me for 5 seconds, Tiago might have lived despite the sabotage." Tears were streaming down her face now. "So when everyone suspected me of killing him, they weren't completely wrong. I didn't sabotage his equipment, but I didn't save him when I could have. And I've carried that guilt every single day for 6 years. The whole time we were investigating Gustavo. The whole time we were seeking justice. Part of me knew I was also seeking redemption for my own failure." I didn't know what to say. The woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I'd committed crimes with, had just confessed to a moral failure that made our entire quest for justice more complicated. "Does this change how you see me?" she asked quietly. "Does it make you wish you'd never helped me?" I thought about it carefully, trying to separate my immediate emotional reaction from a more considered assessment. "It makes me understand you better. It makes what we did more morally complex than I thought. But no, it doesn't make me wish I hadn't helped you. Gustavo was still a murderer. You were still seeking justice for a crime that was real. Your hesitation doesn't excuse what he did." Elena looked at me with such relief that I realized she'd been terrified of my reaction, had been carrying this secret not just for 6 years, but through our entire relationship, waiting for the right moment to confess. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. She took my hand. "Because I'm pregnant." The words hung in the tropical air between us, changing everything instantly. I was 59 years old. I'd raised 2 children who were now adults. I'd never imagined having more, had assumed that chapter of my life was closed, and Elena was 47, an age where pregnancy was possible but complicated, where the decision to have a child was weighted with medical considerations and practical realities. "I know this isn't what we planned," Elena continued. "I know we never talked about children, never made that kind of long-term commitment. But Miguel, I can't raise this child carrying the secret of those 5 seconds underwater. I needed you to know the complete truth before we move forward together, before we become parents, before we build something permanent rather than just sharing an extended moment of intensity." She paused. "So I'm giving you a choice. Knowing everything now, knowing that I'm not the pure victim seeking righteous justice, but a flawed person who hesitated when I shouldn't have, who carries guilt alongside grievance, do you still want to build a life with me?" I looked at Elena, really looked at her, seeing not just the beautiful woman who'd asked me to help her commit crimes, but a complete human being with failures and complexities and moral compromises that matched my own. I'd broken the law for her. I'd abandoned my old life for her. I'd fallen in love with the intensity of our shared conspiracy, but this moment, this choice, was different. This was about choosing her, knowing everything, about accepting that the woman I loved wasn't a simple victim but a complicated person who'd made a terrible mistake in a moment of crisis and had spent years trying to atone. "Yes," I said finally, "I want to build a life with you. I want to raise this child with you. Because you're not perfect, and neither am I, and the justice we sought together wasn't pure, but it was still justice. Gustavo still killed Tiago even if your hesitation contributed to his death. And you've spent 6 years trying to make right what you helped go wrong. That matters." Elena started crying again, but this time from relief rather than fear. "Thank you. Thank you for not judging me, for understanding that guilt and justice can coexist, that seeking accountability for Gustavo's crime doesn't erase my own failure, but doesn't require me to accept blame for murder I didn't commit." We held each other on that veranda, two middle-aged people who'd found each other in the chaos of grief and conspiracy, who'd broken laws together and fallen in love in the process, now facing the prospect of creating new life together despite our accumulated failures and compromises. It wasn't the romantic story I'd imagined when I came to Porto Seguro looking for meaning. It was better and worse and more real than any fantasy. Our daughter was born 7 months later, healthy despite Elena's age and the complications of late pregnancy. We named her Marina, for the sea that had taken Tiago and brought Elena and me together, for the marine biologist who died trying to protect the reefs he loved. Marina's birth certificate listed me as the father and Elena as the mother, with no mention of the complicated history that preceded her existence. She would grow up in Porto Seguro, on the beach where Brazilian history began, where 500 years of complexity and compromise and accumulated guilt pressed down on the sand, like Elena had said. And she would grow up knowing that her parents had sought justice through questionable means, that her mother had loved and failed someone before loving her father, that the world was more morally complicated than simple stories of good and evil would suggest. I'm 64 years old now, 9 years after I met Elena on Coroa Vermelha beach, watching the sunset and crying for a husband she'd failed to save. My old life in São Paulo feels like it belonged to someone else, a careful academic who thought he understood history and morality through the safe distance of research and theory. Porto Seguro has taught me that history isn't distant, that it accumulates in places and people, that we're all complicit in systems we inherit and crimes we didn't personally commit. And Elena has taught me that love isn't simple, that it can coexist with guilt and doubt and moral compromise, that choosing someone means accepting their failures alongside their strengths. Marina is 8 now, brilliant and curious, asking questions about her mother's first husband and why people sometimes whisper about our family. We'll tell her the truth eventually, when she's old enough to understand complexity, when she can process the knowledge that her mother hesitated for 5 seconds, that changed everything, that her father helped commit crimes for justice, that the life they've built together is founded on both love and moral ambiguity. The reefs that Tiago died protecting are healthier now than they were 9 years ago. Gustavo's conviction led to major reforms in how tourism companies access the protected areas, to stricter enforcement of environmental regulations, to greater respect for the marine ecosystems that make Porto Seguro beautiful. Tiago's research, which was buried for 5 years, was published posthumously and became the foundation for new conservation policies across the Bahian coast. His death wasn't meaningless, even if it was preventable, even if Elena's hesitation contributed to it, even if justice came through illegal means. Sometimes I walk the beach where I first saw Elena, watching tourists take photographs and swim in waters that hold so much history. I think about Pedro Alvarez Cabral arriving in 1500, about the Tupiniquim people watching those ships appear on their horizon, about 5 centuries of colonization and resistance and adaptation that followed. I think about how every beautiful place has dark history, how every simple story hides complexity, how we're all navigating moral territory that's far more ambiguous than we want to admit. And I think about Elena, waiting on that beach for a stranger who might help her seek justice and redemption simultaneously, for someone disconnected enough from his old life to take risks that careful people wouldn't take. She was waiting for me, and I was waiting for her, though neither of us knew it until we met. This is our story, then. Not a romance in the traditional sense, though love is certainly part of it. Not a simple tale of justice, though justice was achieved. It's a story about 2 damaged people who found each other at sunset on a Brazilian beach and decided to commit crimes together, to seek accountability for murder while carrying their own guilt, to build a life on foundations that were questionable but strong enough to support a family. It's a story about Porto Seguro, where history began for Brazil and where history never really ends, where the past is always present, where 500 years of complexity accumulates in every grain of sand. And it's a story about moral ambiguity, about how seeking justice sometimes requires compromising principles, about how love can coexist with guilt, about how we're all just trying to do right in situations that don't offer clear answers. Gustavo Rocha is serving his sentence, and probably deserves it. Tiago Mendes is dead and didn't deserve that. Elena hesitated for 5 seconds and has to live with that forever. I broke the law to expose a murderer and made peace with being a criminal for justice. Marina grows up innocent of all this complexity, but will eventually have to process her family's history and decide what it means for who she wants to become. There are no simple conclusions to offer, no moral lessons that fit neatly into philosophical frameworks. There's just what happened, what we did, the consequences we're still living with, and the love we've built despite and because of it all. The sun sets over Coroa Vermelha every evening, the same sunset Elena was watching when I first approached her 9 years ago. Sometimes we go there together, standing at the edge where the Atlantic meets the Brazilian coast, where Cabral's ships first landed, where indigenous and European histories collided and created something new and complicated and uniquely Brazilian. And we watch the sun disappear into the water that holds so many secrets, knowing we've added our own secrets to those accumulated depths, hoping that Marina will forgive us someday for the moral complexity we've given her as an inheritance. This is the story of the woman from Coroa Vermelha, who was grieving and guilty and determined to seek justice, regardless of cost. This is the story of a history professor who came to Porto Seguro to escape predictability, and found instead a conspiracy and a love that were anything but predictable. And this is the story of how we became criminals for justice, lovers through crisis, parents despite our failures, and finally just 2 people trying to live decently in a world that doesn't always reward decency. The water remembers everything, Elena said once. And maybe that's true. Maybe the Atlantic holds the memory of Tiago's death and Elena's hesitation and our illegal break-in, and all the accumulated guilt and compromise that led to Marina's birth. Maybe history never disappears, just accumulates in places like Porto Seguro where the past is always present. Or maybe memory is just a story we tell ourselves, constantly edited and revised, simplified or complicated, depending on what we need to believe about our choices and ourselves. Maybe Elena and I have told ourselves a story about justice and love that makes our crimes feel noble and our failures feel forgivable. Maybe Marina will tell a different story someday, one that sees her parents' actions from a perspective we can't yet imagine. I don't know. I don't have the academic certainty I once had, the clear frameworks for understanding right and wrong that made my old life comfortable. I just have this life, this family, this accumulation of choices, both good and bad, that have brought me here. To a veranda in Porto Seguro where my wife and daughter are laughing at something while the afternoon sun turns everything golden. And for now, for this moment, that's enough. It has to be. Because there's no going back, no undoing what was done, no simple redemption for complex failures. There's just forward, just choosing each day to be present for the people we love, to live with the consequences of our choices, to accept that we're all more complicated than the stories we tell about ourselves. The woman from Coroa Vermelha is making dinner now, calling me inside, and our daughter is setting the table, and the life we've built from conspiracy and compromise and complicated love continues. This is what I found in Porto Seguro when I came looking for meaning, not simple answers or pure redemption, but the messy reality of being human, of making difficult choices in impossible situations, of loving someone who's flawed and being loved despite my own flaws. It's not the story I expected to tell, but it's the only true story I have. And in the end, truth is all we can offer, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it implicates us, even when it refuses to provide the moral clarity we crave. The sunset continues, the water remembers, and we continue too, imperfect people building imperfect lives in a place where history never ends and complexity is the only honest way forward.